Today we will continue with industrialization. Now the last topic which we learned was the iron and steel industry. So first point is Indians and iron and steel is not something new. They knew it from ancient times and so many examples are there. So it was not something new. From the ancient times it was there. But in modern India, which we count, let us say, the last 100, 150 years, we can give the credit to the British rather. They started it in a place called Kulti in Bengal in 1874. These maps I have already shared with you, so just go and revise it. History, it's very necessary, it's essential rather to revise it, to revise. Revise simply means to re-look at it. It stays fresh. Even for teachers, for students, for anyone who's dealing with history as a subject, as a topic, you need to constantly revise it. Now the real beginning, we cannot count as in Kulti. It has to begin with the Tatas, with the sons of Jamsetji Tata, with TISCO, T-I-S-C-O, Tata Iron and Steel Company. And there's a growth very rapidly. Burnpur in West Bengal, IISCO came up all the way across India in the west coast. The Mysore Iron and Steel Company came up, MISCO. Later on it turned into VISCO. And recently, during the second 5-year plan period, 1956 to 1961, we have 3 big iron and steel plants at Bhilai, Rourkela and Durgapur. Until now, till today, these iron and steel plants, including in Jamshedpur, Burnpur, Durgapur, Bhilai, Rourkela, Bhadravati, they're all functioning on the right economic track or the industrial track rather. Stay with iron and steel industry just for a little bit and try to understand the raw materials that are used in iron and steel industry. Firstly is iron ore itself, and then is coal. The function of coal is just as a heat source. Next is manganese, limestone, and in your book it's not mentioned, but let me add dolomite as well. Now these are found in bulk. In bulk means in large quantities, in sufficient quantities, and most importantly they are found in close proximity. That means they are found nearby these factories or nearby these industrial areas. So this laid the foundation of rapid industrialization in India. So that's why when you have the raw materials and the factories situated in close proximity nearby each other, this quickly brings about industrialization. Let me zoom it up. We are looking at these areas, the present areas of Jharkhand, West Bengal, Chhattisgarh and Orissa. So you found all these minerals in close proximity to each other, and that's how industries rapidly developed. So all these are ingredients. Let's look at raw materials as ingredients. Okay, let's move on now. Next point is the capital. Capital is not just the finance. Capital means, let us say, the infrastructure, the factories, the godowns, the shares, the stocks, everything that feeds. It's like your food, your fuel, which keeps the industry going. I mean, the capital required is quite large. And let us look at briefly what happened in India was that in the beginning, the initial problem up to 1850, the book says 1850, the initial problem was of supply, rather of the supply of British capital, the capital from England or from Britain. The book says shy. I think shy is a good word, that's why I kept it there. Like most of you, you are shy, you are hesitant, you don't speak freely. That means shyness is a way of low self-esteem, low self-confidence. You should remove that. You are no different from any other student or child or teenager. So you should remove that shyness. Shyness is a sign that you are not self-confident. You have a low opinion of yourself. That should not be there. You're no different from anyone else. So don't feel shy. Now, why was this shyness there in the beginning? Firstly, when the British came, they didn't come and rule directly. They came to trade specifically with the East India Company. And at that time, India, to put so much money or to invest in money or to invest the capital or to transfer the capital to India, invited a lot of risks, a lot of unknown factors. Up to the 1850s, up to 1857 rather, was quite of an unpredictable place. In 1858, finally, after the revolt of 1857 or the first war of Indian independence, the rule of the East India Company ended and there was a direct rule. That means now it became to be directly under the British Parliament or the British government. So confidence was increased. So you find investment coming up in India after 1858. Confidence was created and then the British capital flow began. The book also reminds us that this capital came in and British industry did business, but most of the profits went out. So the flow of resources or the exploitation also began directly after 1858 with the direct rule. Okay, now let's look at the ownership. That means Indians and British ownership of industry. Firstly, cotton textile. As we learned last week, cotton textile industry were mainly Indian. There was hardly any British involvement. Next is the iron and steel, also Indian. And then jute, the book says 50-50. I think it's a good word. Use it. Let's continue with it. 50-50, yes. Some by the British and some by the Indians, particularly in Bengal. And lastly, but not the least, there are the small industries as well. When we look at four main industries, the lastly is the coal. The coal mining, British were already expert in it. They knew how to do it. Rather, this is what started the Industrial Revolution. They searched for coal in England. Brief history of Industrial Revolution, maybe too brief, is that when they dug up big holes in the ground, it filled up with water. Take out that water, they started to use machines. These machines began to be used in industry. Okay, coal, jute, and plantation. Plantation here would mean mainly the tea plantations. These were all British owned. Today, like I said earlier, I don't like to take a very long class, so the last thing I want to stress upon is about the small scale industries, the small businesses, the small shops, the people working in their own houses. These are also a very important part of industry. We cannot ignore it. Industry doesn't just mean the factories, the big heavy items of production. It's the small scale industries. It's let us say small bits and pieces that put together the whole picture. So regarding India itself, the small scale industries, particularly in the handloom sector, they also adapted and they also modified. Now this was mainly because of the technological changes. They also adapted to the technology. Firstly, they improved their production, and secondly, it decreased their costs. Basically, in a work and time situation, you might do in mathematics also. X number of people take X number of time to do this work. So the time and work equation is better now. This is also a very steady growth. By the second decade of the 20th century, they started to use looms with a fly shuttle. Okay, let's make a small distinction here. Earlier we learned that handicrafts were out of a job. Yes, that is true, but not all. Particularly the weavers who survived. The spinning industry went out of a job. That is entirely true. Spinning means when they have to spin the thread, make the thread. But imagine how many days or weeks or months it would have taken just to create some thread. So that went out of a job because machines replaced that very well. But the weavers, the ones who actually converted that thread into cloth, they adjusted very well. So they used the flying shuttle or the fly shuttle. Who's the inventor of flying shuttle?
Zonki.
Very good. So this basically a British invention in the 18th century, say about 70 years later. It's there in India as well. And Indian weavers are using it. We're talking about weavers on it, by the way. So productivity increased, production also increased, and there's less demand or pressure on labor. And by 1941, just close to independence, over 35% of handlooms in India, their production with flying shuttles or fly shuttles. Now, in other places, let us say in South India, Travancore, Madras, Mysore, Cochin, and even parts of Bengal, it was even higher. It was 70 to 80%. Now, there were other small innovations which also helped weavers improve their productivity and compete with the mill sector. Mill sector means the factories. So yes, production was going on a large scale. Cotton mills were making lots of cloth, employing lots of people, industry went on. But the handicrafts, they were not completely out. It's not that they went to zero. They also somehow survived and they also kept this thing alive. The weavers survived despite problems. They didn't surrender, they didn't go out of production. Actually, steadily they expanded, and 1900 or the beginning of the 20th century up to 1940, just before the British left, they had quite a respectable position. How is this possible? In history, pictures are important. In learning, pictures are important. So in this picture, what I want you to remember is that this tradition of weaving, it carried on. The spinning of making threads, yes, it was finished. It could not compete with the machines in the factories. But weaving carried on. They did not necessarily prosper. That means they continued, but it did not mean that they got rich or they made money out of it. It was a very hard life. They worked long hours, and very often the entire family, the entire household, including women, children, they were all working together in various stages. We still can't put them as a remnants of the past or like a dinosaur. In history, you know what a dinosaur is, isn't it? Or in science. Once upon a time in the past, millions of years ago, they were very powerful. Whether they controlled, they ruled the earth, they were the dominant species. But now they are just in the past. So we cannot look at weavers or handicrafts as remnants of the past. They are not just relics. In the time of factories, they were still relevant, and even till now, they are still relevant. So their life and their labor was integral or very much important to the process of industrialization. You had handicrafts, and therefore you have industries as well. They can't really compete, but still they are there. It had its own place. So in a family setup, everyone has to contribute. And in a way, it's tribute to the strength of families in India. This is one thing we have to be proud of, not just generally over India, but in all parts, including us right here in Kangpopi, in Manipur, in the northeast. Families are very strong. We need to keep it that. Just to give you a sense of what was going on, in 1931 itself, you have the industries coming up. In Bombay, the cotton textile mills are already there. In Bengal, the jute mills are there. And then in small isolated Madras, in the central provinces, that would be Nagpur area, United Provinces, Punjab, Bihar, all of these have industrial centers already established. And these artisans and weavers are also continuing side by side along with them. They also have their place of respect. And factories and large-scale industrial areas are just built on one motive: to make more money, to make more profit. And these people carried on just to keep the tradition alive, just for the pure love of their craft. And they were getting better at it. In a way, this is also comparable to education. Anyways, what we are doing online class, I'm not getting any profit out of it. Rather, I'm running it as a loss if you have to look at it from the income and loss perspective. But just for the purity of teaching, this is what I'm trying to achieve. And you as students, it's more powerful, it makes more sense if you work together in a group. And this is what I want you to think about it this week. Last week, metric results were declared. In the coming future, your results will be there also. It's time now to start planning. Percentage matters, and it does matter a great deal if you want to get into a good school, a good college. So start getting used to that now.